Let's get cancelled.
Hello, LeftTube. Today, we're going to be digging into some brocialist lore and debunking the myth of class reductionism. More specifically, I'm going to be taking us through a classic article that gets shared a lot through Marxist circles called Marxism versus Intersectionality. This video is also in part a response to NonCompete's response to my response to his response to his Quick Rise video on PewDiePie. The video that I'm referring to is called Class Reductionism Keeps the Working Class Divided, Not Intersectionalism. In the video, he purports to outline the differences between liberal intersectionality and proper left intersectionality. Also, we might as well throw in Hunter X. Thompson's 28 Days Later review video called How to Ruin a Revolution, where she argues that a lack of an intersectional approach will ultimately spoil any post-capitalist revolution in the future. She and American Johnson of NonCompete in his video make the case that Marxism alone is not enough. Despite being wrong, her video in particular is pretty good, so go watch it and then come back here. Longtime viewers may have noticed that this isn't the first time I've addressed intersectionality. I've made a couple videos on it already, but I didn't quite cover the topic in as much detail as I could have. So now we're doing it. So the following will be a summary of the article I just mentioned from Marxist.ca. I will be mixing this in with some of my own thoughts and an article published by International Socialism, and then interspersing that with some of NonCompete's video, which we are going to debunk. So go watch the NonCompete video, lest you think I am misrepresenting his arguments. Let's begin. First, what is it? Intersectionality is most commonly used to describe the existence of multiple and overlapping forms of oppression which intersect in different configurations for each individual, creating unique experiences and sets of social barriers. The need to be intersectional is a common phrase used in the movement, implying that any given struggle must be inclusive and representative of individuals experiencing overlapping oppressions, as opposed to narrowly focusing on one group or form of oppression. Unlike Marxism, intersectionality, despite the best intentions of its proponents, cannot adequately explain the origins of the varying forms of oppression, and therefore the solutions. It merely describes the experience of oppression with enhanced clarity. Whereas radical social and economic transformation was the emphasis in the preceding period of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the realm of ideas, thought, and language became the target of analysis and change after that. Having lost faith in the working class's ability to radically transform the economic and social foundations of society, the academic left retreated to an emphasis on changing how individuals think. Stemming from this ideological trend, intersectionality emphasized subjective experiences and individual thought, language, and behavior as the lens through which to understand and overcome oppression, changing the discourse in order to change reality. Marx said that transforming man can only take place under revolutionary conditions, not before, because the ideology of the working class is unavoidably awash in the prejudices and values of the ruling class. You can never fully stamp it out under capitalism because, if you could, it wouldn't be capitalism anymore. Only in a revolution can the proletariat succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of the ages and become fitted to found society anew. Marx goes on, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of dominant material relationships, the dominant material relationships grasped as ideas, hence of the relationships which make the one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. So here Marx is explicit. You can't change the ideas and culture imposed on us by the ruling class under the conditions of the ruling class. You have to change those conditions first. We can and should fight all forms of oppression now, but none of our victories are guaranteed to last until we overthrow the ruling class in capitalist mode of production. The big point, though, is that every reform and new cultural norm can be rolled back so long as capitalism exists. Look at the rise of the alt-right or the erosion of abortion and voting rights in America. Everyone thought that the left had won the culture war, but past gains are now slipping away. Proponents of intersectionality will often argue that because racism and sexism predate capitalism, that we must tackle them first, or that these are the essential driving forces of all oppression. While it's true that they predate capitalism, they don't predate class society. And it's class society of all types that we aim to overcome. White supremacy and racism, which are inherently social and structural phenomena, were developed by the ruling classes of colonial European nations to justify colonial conquest and slavery, and which the development of capitalism was built upon. The oppression of women has not always existed, but emerged with the split of society into classes, and the establishment of marriage as an institution meant to control women's sexuality in order to ensure paternity for the purpose of passing down property. Racist and sexist attitudes reflect these material and social processes. Marxists are not telling black, disabled, trans women that their experience doesn't matter or is of secondary importance. No, we're saying your oppression won't end until the class system is brought down. It is the intersectionalists that are unfairly asking her to endure continued oppression while they wait indefinitely to get their ducks in a row. This backwards rationalization is how liberal and even conservative forces are able to trick people into acting against their own material interest by appealing to the politics of individualism and identity. With intersectionality, we keep treating the symptoms while leaving the much more powerful disease virtually unscathed. In his video, American Johnson of NonCompete cites W.E.B. Dubois to illustrate the limits of class analysis. Here is some Dubois. And while Negro labor in America suffers because of the most fundamental equities of the whole capitalist system, the lowest and most fatal degree of suffering comes not from the capitalists, but from the fellow white laborers. It is the white labor that deprives the Negro of his right to vote, denies him education, denies him affiliation with trade unions, expels him from the decent houses and neighborhoods, and heaps upon him in public insults of open-color discrimination. It is no sufficient answer to say that capital encourages this oppression and uses it for its own ends. So here he's trying to explain that the mode of production and exploitation alone do not account for the discrimination that black people face in America. Dubois goes on to explain that the massive wealth generated by the expansion of capitalism has spurred the creation of a new working class aristocracy of engineers and middle managers, mostly white. A buffer zone of petty bourgeoisie inexorably wedded to the interests of the capitalist class, and against the racialized proletariat. Colored labor has no common ground with white labor. No revolt of a white proletariat could be started if its object was to make black workers their economic, political, and social equals. He points out that even American communists were not free from these racist tendencies and incentives. Thus, he argues that blacks and minorities must organize internally, much as the Black Panthers did. So while the strategy can absolutely be effective in implementing reforms within capitalism to even the playing field, framing it in terms of defense against fellow members of the working class leaves out the possibility of creating a broad-based class movement capable of revolution, not just reform. And it is exactly these politics of reform that we need to move past if we want to get anywhere. But there's one more important point about Dubois here. EJ uses Dubois to make the argument that Marxism isn't enough to negate other forms of oppression. Except, as Lenin shows, properly applied, yes it is. Let me tell you a little story. After the founding convention of the American Communist Party failed to sufficiently address the racial question, as EJ and Dubois make reference to, Lenin's direct interference prompted the party to update its official position to the following: the Negro workers in America are exploited and oppressed more ruthlessly than any other group. The history of the Southern Negro is the history of a reign of terror, of persecution, rape, and murder. Because of the anti-Negro policies of organized labor, the Negro has despaired of aid from this source, and he has been either driven into the camp of labor's enemies or has been compelled to develop purely racial organizations which seek purely racial aims. The Workers' Party will support the Negroes in their struggle for liberation and will help them in their fight for economic, political, and social equality. Its task will be to destroy altogether the barrier of race prejudice that has been used to keep apart the black and white workers, and bind them into a solid union of revolutionary forces for the overthrow of our common enemy. This document was directly influenced by Lenin yelling at them. Just as he mobilized the Russian peasantry and working class, Lenin was always clear that until every worker is free from oppression and exploitation, no one is. This doesn't mean that discriminatory attitudes would disappear overnight following a socialist revolution. Oppression in all its forms has existed for generations, and in some cases, thousands of years, stamping its mark on the consciousness of the human race. However, mass movements have a profound impact on consciousness as people come to see each other for their shared interests and commonalities, instead of seeing each other for their differences as competitors. It is much more difficult to hold on to discriminatory attitudes towards women, immigrants, or LGBTQ individuals when they are out on the streets fighting for the same thing as you, putting their life on the line. During labor strikes, it becomes clear that workers do not have any interest in discriminating against each other, as this would only undermine the strike. During a mass movement, this understanding is reached on a massive scale. The spread of true class consciousness is the only tool powerful enough to simultaneously break through the layers of bourgeois ideology and engender solidarity through common struggle. For an example of this type of solidarity, think back to 9/11 and the false consciousness that united conservative, liberal, left, right, black and white, in opposition to a perceived threat. Muslims were admittedly not included in that one. Now imagine that same power, energy, and solidarity being used for true class consciousness and revolution against the bourgeoisie, instead of murdering Arabs. Only by making plain to see the brutality of our common class enemy can we hope to unite the proletariat and break through entrenched prejudices of class society. But to prove the necessity of intersectionality, American Johnson of NonCompete cites the example of Lenin's handling of the fragmented sectors of the Russian working class and peasantry.
Now, Vladimir Lenin was deeply concerned with the fragmentation of the working class into disparate groups. The fragmented groups that Lenin was most concerned with were all of the various occupations and trades that existed in the late 19th century in Russia, where he was from. So Lenin saw the Russian working class as broadly dissected into an agricultural peasantry and urban intellectual workers. Industrial workers were further divided into various trades, and each of these trades was represented by an individual trade union. So Lenin realized that the key to a successful revolution in Russia was uniting the various trade unions into a cohesive whole, and then uniting the peasants from various regions into a cohesive whole, and then uniting the peasants and the industrial workers into one united working class. And this was honestly a form of intersectionalist analysis. And this analysis and the praxis of building all these disparate groups into a united working class had to happen before the working class could assume a successful revolutionary quality.
So what he's done here is reach back into Marxist history, find an example of Lenin not acting like the caricature of a class reductionist, and retroactively labeling it intersectionality. No, EJ, that's just Marxism. The praxis of uniting disparate groups within the working class is Marxism. That's the whole point. Intersectionalism, on the other hand, only asks us to identify and understand intersecting forms of oppression under capitalism. We can attempt to negate these forms of oppression all day long, but that brings us no closer to class consciousness. Only by standing shoulder to shoulder through struggle against the bourgeoisie do these arbitrary divisions lose their power and relevance.
The idea is that on one hand, you have a broad enough coalition where you're not going to be able to mandate everybody's social etiquette and how they talk or how everybody's personal beliefs are, and I don't think you should try to. But on the other hand, when it comes to substantive matters of rights and equity, that working in shared undertakings and shared endeavors has a positive effect. Yeah. And frankly, I think you even already see that with some of the response, to Bernie reaching out to these broader electorates. So I see a lot of people who make that argument. I see people who just want to be in a clubhouse. I don't see them wanting to actually win or really change anything. And even when Obama, when he signed the executive order and when he followed the lead of the Supreme Court on marriage equity, inside his coalition, the rates of support for transgender rights and marriage equity went up. That's how you do it. Yeah. You don't do it by isolating and demagoguing.
Yeah, well, it's analogous to like people in the labor movement changing their attitudes on race after working together with workers of different races for a shared cause, for common interests. Like so much of the time, this is how these kinds of bigotries, right, that are not based in rationality, you can't always talk people out of it because it's not rational in the first place. That's how these attitudes change. They change with a sense of shared purpose and linked fate.
Now, compare this with American Johnson's shoehorned in intersectional version of the Russian Revolution.
Note that Lenin did not lead the Russians to victory by ignoring the divisions of the working class. He scientifically analyzed the division of the Russian working class, and he diligently and methodically worked with his comrades to dissolve those divisions and rework the working class into a cohesive whole. If he just buried his head in the sand and he pretended that there were no differences and no divisions, if he deceived himself into believing that the peasants and the factory workers were all facing exactly the same hardships and were oppressed in exactly the same way, there would never have been a successful revolution of the working class in Russia. In fact, as Lenin pointed out time and time again, there were deep divisions and animosities and misunderstandings between urban industrial workers and rural peasants, just as the different trade unions were at odds with one another, and unifying all of these disparate quantities into one unified quality was a monumental task, and it took years and years of hard work. And Lenin would have failed outright if he ignored these conflicts and simply took it for granted that the working class would naturally unify and spontaneously rally into a unified revolutionary working class.
To borrow a phrase from Jordan Peterson, EJ is performing a sleight of hand here. How did Lenin dissolve these divisions? Did he lead seminars on steelworker privilege, unpacking the invisible knapsack, or mandatory unconscious bias training for agricultural workers? Did he lead campaigns for equal pay between blacksmiths and tanners? No! The Lenin quote he talks over here is about the need to form coalitions in tactical unity. Nothing to do with the necessity to acknowledge or counter different levels of oppression among different groups before uniting them. You're just adding that in.
The only way to build a unified class is to negate these contradictions. Lenin realized this, which is why he put so much thought and effort into negating the contradictions between the various trade unions of industrial workers, as well as negating the contradictions between the agricultural and industrial workers. Only by negating contradictions like these can class unity finally be achieved. Ignoring contradictions within the working class or insisting that they are unimportant will only lead to deeper contradictions and increased division.
Putting aside for a minute his complete misunderstanding of the concept of negation, this argument is another complete straw man. No Marxist suggests we should ignore conflicts and differences between groups, or that the working class will naturally unify on its own. Solidarity is only achieved through organizing, spreading class consciousness, and common struggle, which is what Lenin and the Bolsheviks did. Lenin was not a proto-intersectionalist, he was a Marxist doing Marxism. I love most of your content, EJ, but unless I'm missing something here, this is a pretty disingenuous take, to my mind.
And class reductionists, on the other hand, refuse to address the fact that the working class has been negated by capitalists into this vast entanglement of oppressed identity groups. So class reductionists present the thesis that the working class is a united entity, and that all other forms of identity oppression are unimportant. We only have to focus specifically on working class oppression.
Alright, first of all, when he says class reductionist, he's really just talking about any orthodox Marxist, Marxist-Leninist, or trot. It's the liberal identity politics version of a slur, just like brocialist or Bernie bro. And Marxists don't refuse to address the ways in which different groups are marginalized differently by capitalism. We talk about it all the time in order to highlight the degrading and exploitative nature of capitalist production, and the need to overthrow it for the benefit of all. On the other hand, the intersectional strategy seeks only to equalize the identified oppression gaps among different groups within the working class. The problem isn't in fighting for better treatment for marginalized groups. The problem is that this goal is a literal impossibility under capitalism. For example, rights and privileges won in the West by marginalized groups necessarily translates to greater exploitation of land and labor elsewhere. You're just passing the buck around the globe, sweeping the problem out of sight and out of mind. It's not for a lack of wokeness and identity politics that's holding back working class revolution, although aspects of those things can be both very radical and helpful. It's the degree to which bourgeois ideology is so thoroughly masking the class system. Workers, and the professional managerial class especially, identify with the worldview of the capitalists under a blanket of false consciousness. So just like what Lenin practiced, Marxists emphasize the need to move beyond observation. Instead, we need to understand why oppressions happen in the first place. For example, intersectionalists like Kimberly Crenshaw view discrimination in the justice system as a problem of framing. If only the judges could better frame their cases within the cultural context, oppression would end. The roots of oppression, they believe, are to be found in society's belief systems. This is wrong. Discrimination is baked into the very nature of hierarchical, capitalist institutions and systems. No amount of unconscious bias training can change that. It is the economic base that lays the general foundation for the dominant views of any given epoch and sets certain limits on how we think and what ideas are considered. While proponents of intersectionality argue against sectioning off of people into single-axis issues, the outcome of the subjectivist approach is instead the sectioning off of people according to an infinite number of configurations of compound oppressions and privileges with no overarching common denominator between them. This is what is suggested by intersectional feminist theorist and scholar Patricia Hill Collins when she states that the overarching matrix of domination houses multiple groups, each with varying experiences with penalty and privilege that produce corresponding partial perspectives. No one group has a clear angle of vision. No one group possesses the theory or methodology that allows it to discover the absolute truth. Indeed, this disorientation serves to muddy the waters of our praxis. Writing for Intersectional Socialism, Laura Miles points out that if class oppression is included at all in intersectionalist discourse, it is only among a number of other possible oppressions to which individuals may be subject. It becomes a mere descriptor rather than an exploitative relationship. This outlook is rather pessimistic, leaving us with only our partial, subjective realities and nothing to explain the origins of oppression, or how to overcome it once and for all. It is a point of view which leads to individualism and self-contemplation rather than collective struggle to transform reality. The world exists concretely outside of our thoughts and feelings. Our understanding of that world is by necessity partial and individual, but it remains a reflection of an objective reality, and our ideas about that reality are continuously tested in practice against it. The set of social and economic relationships that make up capitalism exists objectively. If you don't believe so, go ahead and see what happens if you don't work for a living or pay your rent. Because the vast majority of us live under capitalism and are exploited by it, class analysis and struggle represent the greatest angle of vision and greatest theoretical tool towards uniting and achieving emancipation for all. How are we supposed to organize the working class around the notion of atomized individuals living in different realities? Capitalism creates artificial scarcity. Scarcity creates social divisions for elites to exploit. When want is generalized, all the old crap revives. With intersectionality, the thrust of our political project becomes about uncovering unseen forms of oppression and using that knowledge to equitably distribute the scraps. It asks us to constantly compare and contrast privileges and oppressions with each other so as to vigilantly even the playing field. The problem is, you can never flatten that field while 1% of the population owns half the field and built a sky-high fortress around it. Consider the gender pay gap. Men make more money on average than women do. But it's not because some jerk-faced boss is literally paying a male employee more than a female doing the same job. Capitalism devalues female and reproductive labor from the outset. To focus on men collecting more income is exactly the wrong approach. The true injustice lies in the wealth stolen from you by the capitalist class under whom you are forced to work. The underpayment of marginalized groups creates downward pressure on wages that ultimately hurts even the most privileged workers. Don't equalize down and create an equality of poverty. Equalize up and take what we need from the exploiting and oppressing class.
One of the things I find really frustrating about the disparities discussion, people tend to announce the disparity as if they've also announced the cause and a means to remedy the problem. And disparity is nothing but a statistical measurement, right? Like, it doesn't tell you what caused the disparity, right? And the response is to say, well, race or racism, but that doesn't answer anything. So you got to say, well, okay, now I'll grant that, but how does either race or racism produce this undesirable outcome? And it seems to me that if you're serious about trying to address the outcome, you would want to examine the causal mechanism. But that's what tells me that there's something else going on in disparities discourse besides trying to tackle the immediate disparate outcomes that people focus on.
The oppression of one group works to sustain the capitalist system, which exploits and oppresses all of us in different ways. It's not in any worker's interest for the domination and oppression of another group to continue. This is why Marxist analysis already does everything intersectionality purports to do. The difference is, it points us in the direction of changing material conditions and revolution, instead of leading us into a quagmire of cultural struggle and oppression Olympics. I borrowed this one from Reddit. Marxism is fundamentally different from intersectionality because it acknowledges the class basis of modern society, while intersectionality, on the other hand, views all forms of oppression as equally fundamental. Marxists highlight that class is the fundamental dividing line in capitalist society, even if other strong ones exist. Class is at the bottom of everything. Instead of class solidarity, intersectionality puts forward the notion of allyship, suggesting different sectors of working class and oppressed have different interests and should have their own separate organizations. Marxists argue for a common struggle based on common interests, organized through mass socialist and labor parties and trade unions that fight against all oppressions inflicted upon the working class, and against class exploitation, that is, fights against the whole capitalist system and all that it upholds. Closely related to intersectionality in progressive discourse is privilege theory, the idea that oppression works through a series of unearned advantages enjoyed by those who do not suffer a particular oppression. Implied in the theory is the false notion that improved self-awareness is in fact the key to revolution. Marxists don't deny that privilege exists. We just don't think it's a particularly useful analytical tool for achieving our goals. So, what can end privilege? Communism. Individuals under class society can't opt out of privilege because privilege isn't individual. It's built into the class system itself. To get rid of it, get rid of class. After the revolution, individuals will attempt to enforce white supremacy and patriarchy, to be sure. But without class and hierarchy, they will no longer have the embedded social mechanism through which they can enforce these hierarchies. The danger with privilege politics is that it leads to activists trying to convince sectors of the working class that they actually do benefit from oppressing other layers of the working class, and therefore have opposing interests from them, instead of explaining how it is in all of our interests to unite against the capitalist class. This is the mistake I believe Dubois and E.J. make. Then we get into the logical outcome of using an individualist analytical tool based on standpoint theory, tone policing, purity testing, gatekeeping, and woke scolding, all of which appropriate the language and prestige of intersectionality, but inevitably fail to escape the logic of neoliberal capitalism in the attention economy. When you've been taught to center yourself and your identity for all your political beliefs, what other outcome can we expect? As long as we're subject to this capitalist regime of artificial scarcity, we are fated to reproduce the very systems of competition and exploitation we are trying to end in pursuit of social capital. Later in his video, American Johnson argues that orthodox Marxists are mistakenly conflating liberal intersectionality with the left version, the good one. He claims we need left intersectionality to build class consciousness before we can hope to have a successful revolution. He says we need to first negate all intersecting forms of oppression to unite the working class. But as Marx already laid out, you can't negate oppressions within capitalism. It's oppression whack-a-mole. You stamp out some minority exploitation in the US, it pops back up in Indonesia. It's like trying to play an N64 game on the Sega Genesis. They're not compatible. Just smash the Sega and build a new console altogether, one that works with all the games. Intersectionality's scope of practice needs to be better understood on the left, and I'm here to help. As a tool, it helps us to better understand the composition of the working class under the current mode of production. But as praxis, intersectionality only seeks to reorganize your current workplace to make your exploitation more comfortable and inclusive by enforcing approved vernacular and progressive HR policies. Nowhere does it lay out the path to build solidarity among workers in different sectors or countries. Thus, it contains no revolutionary potential. Adding the word left to it does not suddenly make it so. And by highlighting our differences and competing interests rather than our commonalities, intersectional activism too easily runs counter to achieving class consciousness. What is class consciousness? I ask at the end of my essay. The point at which the working class clears the fog of bourgeois ideology to simultaneously identify its interests and assert its will. It is an awakening, a recognition and assertion of class power. What it is not is an academic project to catalog the infinite matrices of oppression and privilege characteristic of bourgeois society. Nor is it the negation of those differences between disparate identities of the working class. It's not that Marxists are telling LGBT and disabled people to just wait in your place at the bottom of the hierarchy until the revolution, as some have suggested. No, fight for better treatment 100%, but recognize that because the fruits of those atomized struggles will always remain under threat as long as capitalism remains, the politics of total class solidarity must be at the forefront of every fight, which they aren't in intersectional activism. Alright, that concludes my brocialist tirade. So, thumbs up if you liked the video. Thumbs down if you think the real revolution will come when we tell all white people that they are both fragile and racist. And once we've all spent enough time looking inward and examining our own personal biases, then capitalism and oppression will just vanish. It's that easy.